I, for one, cannot wait to hear what he has to say. So, since I really know nothing more, without that, I will hand it over to Mr. Peter Culp. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate all the build-up for the speech. I usually try and set expectations really low, so, but I'll try and live up to it. So yeah, my name is Peter Culp. I'm a partner in the law firm of Squire Patton Boggs based in Phoenix, where I manage our Western Water natural resource practice, which is built mostly around issues managing resource scarcity, water scarcity at scale, and water policy, and more recently looking also at sort of impact investment and sort of strategies to bring private capital to bear on natural resource problems. I work with a variety of different clients on the NGO side. We represent the Nature Conservancy, another of groups like that, a number of major nonprofit environmental foundations, but also quite a few municipalities like the City of Phoenix, Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, some industry, agricultural interests, sort of across the spectrum. What I'm going to talk to you about today is about Minute 319, which is a new agreement on the Colorado River between the United States and Mexico that I think is a pretty successful example of transboundary water management on the Colorado River. It's sort of near and dear to my heart. I've actually been working on this issue since I was a law student, wrote a law review article about it as my sort of first project on the Colorado River, and have been involved pretty deeply ever since. But I think the experience of this agreement and what was achieved maybe provides a few lessons to fit into this theme of, what does successful transboundary management look like? How do we make it happen? And certainly, I think, particularly in this context, which is probably one of the most conflict-ridden river basins anywhere in the United States, and maybe in the world. So this is, for those of you who I'm sure are all familiar with this, but this is the Colorado River Basin, a map produced by the Bureau of Reclamation that shows the sort of geographic boundaries of the basin, but also some of the areas outside of it, which are supplied by the water of the Colorado River Basin. One of the unique characteristics of this river basin is that much of its use is actually located outside the geographic boundary. The river now supports in excess of 35 million people, 5.5 million acres of irrigated farmland, and it's probably easily the most heavily regulated river system in the world. We have extreme control over this resource. It is dammed and redammed and used and reused repeatedly along its length. We know where every drop of it really goes, and it's very carefully accounted for. The river is governed by a collection of laws, court cases, federal statutes, international treaty, interstate compacts that we lovingly refer to as the law of the river, sort of the Bible of Colorado River management. What that law in many ways has been concerned with over the years has been managing this river's extraordinarily high level of variability. In a good year, this river will produce 25.5 million acre feet. In a bad year, more like 5.5. And that extreme variability has driven a lot of the way in which we've developed and used this river over time. It's also a basin which has effectively grown up, as it were. This is a graph of water supply and demand in the basin, showing a 10-year running average of water supply in the blue, and a 10-year rolling average of human water demand on that supply in the red. And as you can see, relatively recently, sort of in the 2003 timeframe, human use of surface water in this basin began to far exceed the natural supply and has exceeded it consistently every year ever since, and it's expected to do so essentially indefinitely into the future. If you were to put groundwater use on this graph, we'd be somewhere up here. In fact, there's a recent NASA study showing that over the past decade, we've lost 67 cubic kilometers of net storage in this basin, most of which in the loss of groundwater storage due to overuse. And so that challenge is going to sort of sit behind a lot of what I say today. That overuse issue relates in part to the way in which the river was divided up in its inception, the sort of fundamental founding document for the law of the river is something called the 1922 Colorado River Compact among the various basin states inside the United States. That essentially divided the river in half and gave half of it to the upper basin of the Colorado River, which is Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, and Colorado, and half to the lower basin, Nevada, California, and Arizona. The lower basin has the highest priority. They get their water first, then the upper basin gets theirs. Unfortunately, when that compact was decided and negotiated, we believed there was quite a bit more water in this river than was actually there. Turned out that 1922 was right in the middle of what we now understand to have been the wettest 30-year period in 3,000 years. Just through bad luck, they actually even tried to leave some extra water unaccounted for to take care of Mexico, but as it turned out, they overshot significantly. That was not a big problem for the first 80 years or so because we were still on the bottom end of this curve. But it's a big problem now. And what that sort of reality now means is that for the upper basin states, which have this lower priority and have to deliver water first, they're maxed out. There's nothing left to develop. And there's an argument, of course, about that. You know, could we get a little more here, a little more there? But the reality is that there's not much left to develop. And it also means that they're going to be exposed to the brunt of the hydrologic risk that we're beginning to see in climate change. In the lower basin, the problem is one of overuse. We developed the water supply given to the lower basin under the compact completely without accounting for things like reservoir evaporation and the half of the water we owe to Mexico under the treaty and, you know, trees and stuff like that that use water. And as a result of that, we now have a deficit, which means that every single year when we don't get extra water into the lower basin of the Colorado River, Lake Mead will fall predictably, lose about 1.2 million acre feet of storage, which translates to somewhere between 13 and now about 20 feet because we're down in the lower end of that reservoir. Most of that falls onto the state of Arizona and now also to Mexico, as I'll describe in a bit. And that is creating some very significant shortage risks that have been driving some very dramatic changes in the conversation around the river. So what I'm going to focus on today is actually just one of the most problematic parts of the law of the river, which is the relationship between the United States and Mexico. It's definitely been a very difficult and very fraught relationship over the years, and really not a very pretty story. The treaty, which was signed in 1944, was the end of a probably nearly 40-year campaign by Mexico to be recognized as a legitimate user of the Colorado River. They, of course, historically received 100% of the river's flow in a very complex geopolitical environment during World War II, which included the need to deny oil to the Japanese and the war in the Pacific. This treaty was signed giving Mexico 10% of the river that they used to receive 100% of. And there was a boundary commission formed, which is now known as the International Boundary and Water Commission, which was actually formed after the Mexican War and then inherited this responsibility after the treaty was signed. But has had a very difficult relationship over the years. And just to put that in perspective, the commission was formed to settle the boundary. They actually didn't really even complete that work until the 1990s. And so many of the issues that have sort of been on the border even since the 1850s are still sort of alive and well, particularly in the minds of the people of Mexico. But that treaty essentially gives Mexico 10% of the water. It provides for proportional sharing of shortages in times of extraordinary drought. I should actually have quotes around all those words. Unfortunately, the treaty didn't define any of that. And that has been the sort of driving document behind the U.S.-Mexico relationship. The treaty originally didn't actually have a water quality requirement, and that was finally introduced in the 1970s after a bitter war over salinity in which the United States had been delivering essentially salty groundwater to Mexico in lieu of river water, had killed off a lot of Mexican crops and fields, and finally led to this salinity agreement. after Mexico drilled a whole series of wells along the U.S. boundary and began to pump groundwater out from under the United States. The U.S. retaliated. We built our own set of wells. It's great. It's worth looking at someday. It looks sort of like the Berlin Wall or something down there. But anyway, we reached this agreement. But that was really, in some ways, only one of the only bright spots in the treaty relationship. Under that agreement, Mexico is entitled to water at 2 locations: the northerly international boundary, where Arizona, Mexico, California come together right here. They receive about a little 85–90% of their entitlement there, and then they receive the balance down here. The U.S. collects up a bunch of agricultural drains, and we deliver the agricultural drainage water to Mexico as part of their entitlement. Mexico then takes that water and distributes it inside the Mexicali Valley Irrigation District, known as Irrigation District 14. It's one of the largest irrigation districts in Mexico and one of their more significant food-producing regions. That water, essentially, they use essentially all of the water that's delivered across the border to them, primarily for agriculture, but also to support some cities, the city of Mexicali, city of San Luis Rio Colorado, and then Tijuana out on the coast. So that Mexican agriculture ended up replacing an ecosystem of sort of continental significance in the Colorado River Delta. Had been significantly deprived of water by the U.S. dam development, and then Mexico then sort of completed the deprivation of water by converting most of the former Delta region into agriculture. The U.S. converted this portion of the Delta, is now the Imperial Valley Irrigation District, or Imperial Irrigation District, excuse me, in the Imperial Valley. That ecosystem was about 1.8 million acres in size of wetlands at the turn of the last century. Dam development and agricultural development took essentially 100% of the water out of that ecosystem. It had declined to around 40,000 acres by the 1970s. And had essentially wiped out a very important fishery in the northern Gulf of California that had been dependent on that delta. The net effect of that was to convert something that looked probably like this in 1900 to something that looks a lot like this in most of the expanse of the former delta. Thousands of square miles of either agriculture or essentially empty flats. Around that, so by the 1970s, I think we'd more or less concluded that this ecosystem was a dead ecosystem. But in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a series of floods that occurred that actually brought some significant water back into the ecosystem for the first time in probably about 20 years. And there was this immense regeneration of habitat, a connection with that. And that generated some real interest in restoring, maybe not in the old delta, but a sort of limited delta, something that could be managed within the framework. And there were some very interesting efforts to begin a community-based restoration effort in Mexico, working with local communities to begin restoring small sites to sort of remind people of the resource that they had once had and get the community involved in it. It was extremely successful. They've started about 3 major sites, which are continuing to grow today, around a plan that would sort of help put the Delta back as an important anchor for the Pacific Flyway and also an important community resource within Mexico. Among other things, that effort led to the formation of a water trust in Mexico, which I'll talk about later, which is now playing a very important role in that. Importantly, at this stage too, there were a series of court cases in the late 1990s which failed, which were trying to force the United States to take some responsibility for this resource. The courts denied those claims, and it led to the exit of most of the organizations and groups that were employing a litigation and sort of advocacy strategy, and left behind a number of groups that then began pursuing a more collaborative approach to getting this resource protected. That community effort led to the creation of a report called Conservation Priorities in the Colorado River Delta. in around 2004 that began identifying a sort of vision for what this limited restoration might look like. This is just a map taken out of that report. But it was ultimately realized that you were going to need to have binational cooperation to make this happen. It could not be done within Mexico alone. You needed the participation of both the United States and Mexico to manage what is ultimately a binationally significant resource. But it was very difficult to really figure out how to do that. But while all this was going on, and this is sort of where I guess maybe the catalyst part comes in, we began moving in the Colorado River into what is now a 16-year, nearly 17-year drought, which shows no signs of ending. And when I started working on this stuff, we didn't talk about shortages. People who talked about the imbalance and the deficit in Lake Mead and all that stuff, they were mostly just academics. No one paid attention to them. All we did was really fight over the allocation of surplus water. But this drought started, and and it had some very dramatic and immediate effects on the river. This is the upper end of Lake Powell, the major storage reservoir in the basin in 1999. That's the same spot 5 years later. And those two images, I think, maybe just provide maybe a sense of how much the view of this resource changed and how quickly. River managers that had talked about nothing except fighting about the allocation of surplus began to be extremely concerned about the potential for large-scale shortages in the lower basin, and that in particular, and that really changed the conversation. There was essentially that drought and the declining reservoir elevations left the states within the U.S. with essentially no time to litigate or fight anymore. We were essentially forced to work together. There were endless series of meetings. There was the first several years of that were really remarkably unproductive. After the first 2 years, I think the only thing we had actually agreed on is that we should definitely short Mexico. But we hadn't figured out how we would allocate any shortages inside the United States. Finally, the federal government threatened that if the states didn't reach an agreement, they would start an environmental impact statement process, a NEPA process, in which this would be decided. And that finally provoked the states and others to get into agreement. That agreement negotiated in 2007, which interestingly the NGOs played an important role in too, which I can talk about, folks who are interested, but led to what were called the interim shortage guidelines, which set up a new strategy for beginning to manage the basin sort of more as a unit, treating the lakes as if they were a single lake instead of the upper basin competing against the lower basin, working to manage shortages, agreeing to shortage conditions tied to reservoir levels that we would take action, begin cutting back use, and creating a new storage program in the lake. That system was a huge improvement over what we had had before, which hadn't even contemplated anything that shortages could even happen, and created a lot of new flexibility and introduced some new tools. But it was also recognized that we needed to make progress in the binational environment as well, because ultimately real conjunctive management of the river couldn't take place without Mexico being a partner in it. But the binational relationship was so strained at that point that it was really almost impossible to see how that could occur. The International Boundary and Water Commission, which is composed of a U.S. section and a Mexican section, was at that stage not even talking, the two sides weren't even talking to each other. There had been litigation between the United States and Mexico over a canal lining project in the U.S., and really the relationship was probably as bad as it had been in 20 or 30 years. And in some ways, the U.S. view of the river hadn't yet evolved to really think about how to include Mexico as a partner. This is a map that came out of this 2007 environmental impact statement that was released in relationship to that agreement I was talking about. This is this 1974 version of that map created by the Bureau of Reclamation, showing the basin. As you'll note, Mexico is apparently not in the basin, and neither is the Colorado River Delta. And 2007 map, same thing. We really haven't, the viewpoint really had not changed. But it was sort of recognized by, I think, the stakeholders in particular, some of the U.S. state representatives, some of the major water utilities, and certainly many of the Mexican stakeholders, that we really needed to move past that really fraught federal relationship and begin looking at how we could work collaboratively on the border. That was actually accomplished through a series of workshops that were organized by non-governmental organizations, most environmental groups primarily, which sort of took advantage of the fact that they were non-state, non-federal actors. Really, the states are not supposed to be talking to each other without the federal government. Mexican states and U.S. states, there are some contexts in which that can occur, but the NGOs weren't really subject to those same rules. And so began organizing workshops that brought the non-federal parties to the table on both sides of the border to begin looking at how could we work together, and could we actually frame up the outlines of an agreement we could then deliver to our respective federal governments to encourage them to come together on an agreement. That was actually quite successful, triggered a sort of an immune response in the State Department in the U.S. and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. They quickly issued a press release establishing a formal process, and essentially everyone who had participated in those workshops was then invited to become a part of this more formal thing known as the Joint Colorado River Cooperative process, which was a stakeholder-led international set of working groups that began focusing on these 4 primary areas, or priority areas on the border, and then set up also a core group which included both U.S. states, major water utilities in the United States, environmental groups, and their counterparts in Mexico to begin sort of vetting the solutions that these working groups were coming up with. And that really began to significantly change the character of the binational relationship in a way I'll talk about in a minute. That process ultimately led to 4 new international agreements, the first 3 of which just listed here, 316 through 318, which provided an experimental program to provide water to a wetland, a minute that formalized the binational stakeholder process as an official part of the treaty process going forward, as well as a storage mechanism that we had been advocating for on the NGO side in Lake Mead to allow Mexico to begin using U.S. storage, which we needed on the environmental side, and Mexico needed for its own management purposes. Interestingly, that particular agreement was key ultimately to getting the deal done. And it was precipitated, in fact, by a tragedy. We were having a lot of difficulty moving this process forward with everybody wanting to only agree on a package, and you couldn't quite figure out what that package was, and there were too many interests. Everybody knew the storage component was going to be key. There was an earthquake in 2010 in Mexico that destroyed most of their primary canal infrastructure. And there was a sort of sudden, tremendous humanitarian need to have this storage mechanism in place. And the 2 sides worked together to get that done, sort of working around that. And in many ways, one of the other important things that happened just shortly before these agreements began to come together, the 2 leaders of the process from the 2 commissioners of the International Boundary and Water Commission, Commissioner Carlos Marin, Commissioner Arturo Herrera, were killed in a plane crash together. And it was actually, I think, between the earthquake, attribute sort of the earthquake and also the memorial service for those 2 gentlemen were sort of the things that really pushed us to just get this done, because we couldn't not succeed. I mean, we needed to do something in memory of these 2 people that had worked so hard on the border, and we needed to do something for the Mexican people in light of the earthquake. So the culmination of that was minute 319. It's a very comprehensive agreement around Colorado River management between the United States and Mexico. Certainly the largest change we've seen to the framework since the 1944 treaty was signed. It includes a variety of provisions, the sharing of surpluses and shortages between the United States and Mexico for the first time. on a voluntary basis, not defining the treaty, but agreeing that we can agree to do it this way, sort of regardless of what the treaty language actually means. Setting up this storage mechanism, which is made more permanent, allowing Mexico to use U.S. reservoirs to store their water for the benefit of both countries. Setting up water exchanges to allow the movement of water across the border on a limited basis. And most importantly to my clients, which was the Nature Conservancy in this negotiation, a commitment to restoration of the Colorado River Delta ecosystem, setting up an environmental flow program in which both countries, together with the NGOs, created the water necessary to rewater this ecosystem and begin undertaking restoration at a much larger scale than we've been able to do on a sort of purely private basis, as well as some joint science. And that was really, in some ways, one of the first international agreements of its type, at least that we're aware of anywhere in the world, where two countries were deliberately committing to put water into a threatened ecosystem. So some essential principles of that agreement were really this notion of partnership. And I mean, it sounds in some ways fairly simple, but the notion that the U.S. and Mexico had to share in both the benefits and burdens of the management of the Colorado River system seems kind of straightforward, but that was a difficult place to get given the history between these two countries. But we were able to move this sort of conversation into one in which there needs to be a partnership between the two countries and move beyond the sort of arm's length international relationship that they had had. That was particularly important for Mexico, which, as I'm sure all of you know quite a bit about the history of the U.S.-Mexico relationship on immigration and economics and everything else, but Mexico had rarely felt like they were being treated like a partner in river management. It was more like the United States just sort of telling them what was going to happen, what our latest set of activities are, and by the way, we have all this great technology that you guys should be using, but you probably can't afford to use, things like that. This was a process. This agreement really brought them in as a real partner, which was incredibly important, and created a real sense of transparency in which the two countries actually began sharing data for the first time on a whole variety of things, including water use and groundwater, things like that. It created this principle that water should actually flow to this binational ecosystem, and I talked a little bit about this commitment. The NGOs helped with that commitment using this Colorado River Delta Water Trust. We ultimately committed a third of the water to the ecosystem in exchange for the United States and Mexico also contributing a third each to the ecosystem through the agreement. And we created a sort of joint binational monitoring program and science effort that began bringing scientists together across the border to evaluate the results. That was deliberately set up as a sort of a pilot agreement. We decided early on that given the complexity of the issues we were dealing with in those negotiations, we had sort of two choices. One was to have a lasting, very simple and not very comprehensive agreement because about the things we really understood. And the other was to have a really comprehensive agreement that tried out a whole bunch of stuff and then committed to renegotiate after 5 years. And we chose the latter path. As a result of that, we were able to do something that was far more comprehensive than we could have otherwise done because both countries felt like they weren't necessarily committing to this permanently. We could just try it for a few years and see what happens. Of course, in practice, once you've tried it and it starts to work, then everyone wants to keep it. And so the idea was we would try it out and then after 5 years put a new framework in place that would hopefully build on the original one and get done before the end of the pilot period. Some unique characteristics of that process were, I think, in many ways, just the way in which stakeholders were actually engaged in international diplomacy. It was certainly unprecedented in some ways in U.S.-Mexico diplomacy anyway, which it had been more of an arm's length kind of relationship before that. It was building on this foundation that had been built inside the United States through the 2007 agreement, which had gotten U.S. stakeholders together to reach an agreement, and which the major states who had always been fighting with each other were actually agreeing on a cooperative management framework. And for the first time, NGOs were actually participating directly in negotiations with the basin states. And it built was, I think, to a very great degree, really on developing trust on the border. This agreement really had a lot more to do with people and the relationships of trust than it did with the substance of this relationship. Most of this agreement was negotiated on a bus, while U.S. and Mexican stakeholders were driving around looking at all this stuff that neither of them had ever seen. There was and sort of getting to actually know the infrastructure of the other party and begin to understand the problems that the other side was having. And both sides were learning a lot through that process. We were learning things we could do better in the United States. They were learning things we could do better in Mexico. And we were both developing an appreciation for the challenges that each side, or very real challenges that each side had. And a lot of it was done over beers and drinking cerveza in Mexican restaurants. Mostly in Mexico, and as a sort of example of the border relationships influence on this. We could no longer meet in the United States after one of the chief Mexican negotiators was detained by the Border Patrol for 6 hours. And after that, which nearly killed the agreement, believe me. We ended up having to meet in Mexico for the rest of the time to avoid that ever happening again, because we couldn't get a guarantee from Homeland Security that it wouldn't occur a second time. But sitting in restaurants, working through issues like that, and sort of dealing with people. Bob Snow is the gentleman from the solicitor's office who worked extensively on this, credits this agreement primarily to a really good mole at one of the Mexican restaurants that a lot of meetings were held at. I personally credit to what we called the Minute 319 Tequila, which was a result of a rather famous or infamous episode where the negotiating group had gotten out too late from the sessions in Tijuana. There was nowhere to eat. It was still open, but somebody knew a restaurant that was open like 8 or 10 blocks away. So we're all walking along in the streets of Tequila, or in Tijuana. And we had tequila the second time. Anyway, we show up at the restaurant, and it turns out they're having this special where if you order a shot of tequila, you get a free bottle. And so 20 shots of tequila later, we had 20 bottles of tequila, and the whole U.S.-Mexican delegation is sort of happily walking back to the hotel with our tequila bottles. We drank the last 2 tequila bottles the night the agreement was signed, sitting at the Hotel Coronado in San Diego. So anyway, it was really about, in many ways, this sort of trust-building process and sort of seeing the other side as human with real challenges. One of the other things that was really unique was the role of environmental organizations as real sort of transboundary actors. They were involved in a lot of different ways throughout the course of the negotiations, including, as I mentioned, sort of helping to get the process started and sitting at the table more or less throughout, although many of the federal to federal negotiations, pretty much everyone was kicked out of the room. But they had built a set of resources and relationships across the border over the span of a decade or more of efforts on this Colorado River Delta ecosystem that made it possible for them to sort of help facilitate collaboration, make introductions, help interpret what the two sides were saying. When the U.S. took a hard line, there were Mexican NGOs who could say, yeah, but the U.S. really means this. And when the Mexico took a hard line, we could help facilitate a solution on the other side. This Delta Water Trust entity, which played a really interesting role, didn't actually have a huge amount of water to work with, but until that time, restoration of this ecosystem always looked like a zero-sum game. The water was going to have to come from somebody else. And the trust, by acquiring some rights and beginning to pledge them to this system in the spirit of binational cooperation, began to open up a space where we begin to talk about more creative approaches to delivering water to the ecosystem other than just forcing someone to give it up. One of the most successful, I'm just going to share just a couple of photos. One of the most successful outcomes of this was an experimental flood released into the Delta ecosystem in March of 2014, continued for several months. This is just the first water coming out of the Morelos Dam, which is the last diversion dam on the Colorado River. The river below this is essentially dry. There's about 1 cubic foot per second typically in the river below that dam. And it dries out completely within about 15 miles. It's a completely dry sand channel. That flow ultimately reached the ocean after a sort of a very long travail across some very difficult empty desert terrain. But there were some amazing moments from that. This is the Raise the River duck, which was part of the fundraising campaign for the trust. This little duck spent most of its time at the very front of the pulse flow. That's the leading tongue of water as the river was making its way across the desert. There was, this amazing scene at San Luis, Rio Colorado, a community in Mexico right on the Colorado River, named after the Colorado River, but which had known the river as a dry channel since the 1960s. And there were really, literally 2 generations of people that had never seen a river. As soon as the pulse flow came through, there was actually a whole crowd waiting for it as the river sort of made its way around the corner, and then the mariachi band started playing, and kids started splashing in the water. And anyway, it turned in actually a sort of a 2-week Mexican beach party that lasted, they ultimately had a Ferris wheel and a mariachi band playing 12 hours a day, and vendor food stands, and everyone would come down there after work. Anyway, really quite neat. So the significance of this agreement, I think in many ways, really has as much to do with the border-water relationship as anything. It was getting to this notion of partnership. And getting past those sort of arm's length relationships that had defined the border relationship for more than 100 years, and really beginning to build some trust and common ground, and maybe most importantly, a sort of common narrative that the 2 countries could share. One of the interesting things to me as a lawyer about this agreement was beginning to understand that that the 2 sides had to tell a very different story about this agreement in order for it to work. The U.S. had to be able to tell a story in which this was Mexico stepping up to become a partner in river management and help us out with shortages and recognize the benefits of the reservoir system that we'd created. And for Mexico, it was really about the U.S. stepping up for the first time to kind of move past this policy of unilateralism that they had perceived us having. And we were pretty successful in some ways in, over time, beginning to merge those 2 narratives where we could each tell each other's story and tell a sort of single story about why this agreement was important. Obviously, the commitments to the Delta ecosystem are a huge step forward. It's an incredibly significant issue in Mexico, both culturally and economically, for the people down there. And it's proved to be actually a really important international agreement, although I think no one had any idea at the time that it would be. But it's been translated into a number of different languages, and not too long ago someone mailed me a copy of it that had been translated into Russian, which was pretty odd. I actually get this document in Russian. I don't speak Russian, but I sort of, this looks kind of oddly familiar. And then realized that someone had actually translated it to help with a border dispute in Tajikistan. So anyway, there's a great, if you'd like to learn more about this minute and the process used to it, I'm just going to give a quick plug to a law review article, mostly written by my associate Jonathan King, with some help from myself and my counterpart in Mexico, a gentleman named Carlos de la Parra, which sort of goes into the history of this agreement and what its significance really is, maybe in the border relationship. So with the time I've got left, I'm just going to talk a little bit, I guess, about the challenges looking forward. We're in the midst of implementing this agreement. It's been challenging. There have been some great successes like the pulse flow. There's a lot of stuff we're still struggling with. But we're now looking towards the end of this pilot period and really what the next agreement is going to look like, which we're now calling minute 32X. We thought it was going to be 320, but it turns out that's an agreement on the Tijuana River, and now it looks like there'll probably be some seating chart arrangements and other kinds of stuff that'll get decided as other minutes. So we'll end up, so it's now 32X. But the next agreement is really facing, I think, in some ways a more daunting challenge, which is to really begin to face the issues around shortage risks in this basin. This is actually just a map put together. It's recently published in the Environmental Research Letters, projecting stress, watershed stress in the United States. Red is bad, green is good. As you can see, most of the West doesn't look like it's going to be in great shape, but this area, which is the Colorado River Basin, is in some ways, along with California, sort of the epicenter of where projected watershed stress is going to be manifesting in the future. And the realities are, sort of given that deficit situation I was talking about, even if we get a couple of good years that sort of rescue us from the current crisis on the river, there's a really high probability of shortage in the future on this system. Part of that is being driven by this. This is a graph produced by the Bureau of Reclamation as part of something called the Colorado River Basin Study, published in 2012, right around the time the minute was signed, which is a great study of a river. If you would like to, it's, I think, one of the most interesting and comprehensive studies of a river basin that's been done by the federal government. But it looks at, this is a graph showing water supply and demand, picking up on that one I showed you earlier, and then projecting it out into the future. And what you can sort of see is that, you know, obviously demand for water in this basin is increasing. Supply is not going to keep up with that demand, obviously, and if anything is going down. And that gets you to somewhere between a 20% to as much as a 50% shortfall in water supply within a few decades. Of course, a lot of that's in some ways not very real, because you're not going to be able to use more surface water than really exists, but you can use more groundwater in many places, and that's going to be a continuing challenge. But I think more fundamentally is this, and this is, I won't bore you too much with this graph, but this is also put together by Reclamation, and it's looking back at the last 100 years of stream flow. This is, on this axis, is the amount of thousands of acre feet, essentially, and of water flow in the Colorado River. The box here defines essentially the world as we know it, the world of the average, 75% of the time to 25% of the time, what you mostly expect to see. The whiskers sort of define the extremes, the more extreme scenarios that we sort of expect to see based on the world we've known it. This is an effort to reconstruct the flow of the river going back 2,000 years or so. And what you can see is the box is, the world as we know it is a little different, a little lower, but also maybe more importantly, the extremes are far greater than we've ever seen just in that historic record. And then this is the world of climate change. And this is a very conservative, in the sense of probably lowballing it, projection of how much stream flow one might lose as a result of climate change in the basin. And as you can see, the world of the average becomes much different than the world we've known, with a lot greater variability and much more extreme events. And interestingly, this red line here down the middle, that's the average that we've known since 1991, which includes this drought. And that average over the last, about half drought, about half not drought, is actually more or less the world that the climate models are predicting we're going to live in. Which obviously has some major challenges for us. We're getting a little bit of a preview of that now in the Colorado River Basin. System storage throughout the system is now at the lowest point it's ever been. It's as if Lake Powell never existed. Lake Mead is now lower than at any point it was since it was first built in the 1930s. And as a result of that deficit that I was talking about, that's projected to continue into the future. This is just a projection of what could happen to the elevation of Lake Mead were the drought to continue. You know, we're sort of right in here right now. And essentially, if the drought was just the last 10 years were just to be repeated, Lake Mead would just continue on this trajectory, which is being driven by lower basin water use. Not by drought, but just simply by the fact that we don't have the extra water that we've come to depend on above our legal allocations. The only hydrology here actually is this little uptick here where we had a particularly wet year in the middle of the drought that gave us a little bit of extra to work with. But all that really does is sort of reset the clock on that decline. And as you go through here, you end up doing some bad things happen. The red line is shortages in the lower basin being imposed. Around this level, there's no agriculture left in central Arizona. Hydropower at Hoover Dam stops sort of in this range. Around here, Las Vegas starts facing major threats to its water supply. And elevation of 1,000 is an elevation we're not allowed to get to under any circumstances. It's the there be dragons level in this reservoir where we just can't go. And I think that challenge, which is going to be important in a minute, is really in some ways part of a broader issue that we're facing in the Western water management systems, where we've built most of our infrastructure around a sort of stationarity principle that the future will look like the past. We've managed the variability we know about with these pretty large publicly funded infrastructure buffers. We've set up these big institutions and bureaucracies to manage that for us. And all of that is proving to be pretty slow moving in the face of conditions that depart significantly from our historical experience. And we also tend to continue to talk about water in a pretty sort of static way, as if it's a supply-demand problem. There's more demand than supply, and so the sort of implicit assumption somehow is that if we were to just sort of take the water that's being used over here and put it over there, whether that's, take it from agriculture and give it to a city, or take it from agriculture and give it to a stream for in-stream flow, that's going to somehow make it all better. We're going to be able to return to a static state. And we even frame a lot of the environmental problems that way. I mean, many of our sort of fundamental environmental laws are about protecting a status quo, which in many ways may no longer exist as climate change takes big ecosystems and just starts to move them north out from underneath us. That's, I think, in many ways is sort of driving a need for new kinds of institutions that really give us a great deal more flexibility in the face of that kind of variation, and begin thinking about how to address these kinds of cross-cutting risks that affect municipalities and agriculture and industry and the environment and tribes and states and everyone all at the same time, and begin managing those together. So just looking to the future of this, of the international scene, we're now working on the next stage of this agreement. Getting there in many ways is going to depend upon continuing to be successful with the implementation of Minute 319, but I think is fundamentally going to be about beginning to face this larger sort of systemic risk, which we started to think about in the first agreement, but I think we haven't really, in some ways, really come to terms with yet. The sort of key framing is clearly going to be this notion of partnership between the two countries, and really working on building the transparency, building communications, continuing to engage stakeholders to build trust and sort of build a new narrative around the river that will get us there. It's not totally clear what that agreement's going to look like. I do think that we will be successful in continuing essentially everything that was accomplished in Minute 319. Some things may be harder than others. We'll probably be doing more binational projects. We're probably going to try and, over time, expand the scope of this agreement to embrace a broader transboundary geography and bring in some other areas of the Delta, other cities out on the Pacific coast that were sort of left out of the last agreement. Begin managing, working much more deliberately on water quality issues, which are a fundamental issue on the border, which have been very difficult to talk about, along with groundwater. And I think in particular, I think we're going to be working pretty hard to begin thinking about this notion of what we're calling system conservation, which is that there needs to be a commitment from both sides to conserve water for the benefit of the system as a whole, to begin to reduce these sort of systemic risks that we're facing on both sides of the border. But the key to that, I think, overall is really ultimately just going to be people and building trust based on the experience the last time around. And I think that's an important lesson, it has been an important lesson for me as a lawyer, and I think it's one I'd love to communicate to any young lawyer coming out, is that, you know, this was a problem that was 90% people and personalities. It was about 10% substance. And building those relationships of trust and beginning to talk about this problem, talk to each other, and maybe even talk about each other in a different way than we had, was pretty key to being able to get there. The role of law in this agreement was really to use the law creatively to find a solution that could work that would sort of match that developing narrative of trust. We didn't change the treaty, we built a new structure on top of it. I mean, changing the treaty would have been impossible. But in fact, having both sides sort of saying, well, that's what the treaty says, but it's not really working that well. So we'll keep the treaty, you know, we can always sue each other later, but let's try and build a new structure on top of it to sort of try out a new relationship of cooperation. And that was really the role of law and the role of the lawyers, was to find a creative way through that framework that would sort of protect the legal interests of both sides, but give them an opportunity to really explore a different approach to collaboration, to deal with a bunch of issues we couldn't deal with before on a basis really of comedy, as opposed to because the treaty says we have to do it. And you know, I'm optimistic we're going to get there. Like in the 2007 agreement between the states, we don't have time to litigate. These challenges are coming at a rate and a scale that is unprecedented, and the only way through it is for the two sides to work together to find a solution. So that's what I had to share with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thanks. I think we have time for some questions. Yes, sir.
I would throw out the issue of water that was set aside for trust the whole California actually makes it all the way through the Gulf of California. It doesn't get coached on the way down across the border.
So part of that is actually easier than it looks because there's been no water delivered below the Morelos Dam diversion structure since the 1960s. There's no diversions down there. If you get water past the dam, it's going to stay there. You know, you can, although it might disappear into the sand, which is sort of what happens to quite a bit of the water that does reach there. So at least on the binational framework, both countries, I mean, made a commitment that that wouldn't happen. There's enforcement, obviously. There were a few people that tried to throw hoses in the river with a pump, and the National Water Commission in Mexico had water police driving around to check that out. Actually, it was mostly the environmental groups, and local community members were more like the water police because they were all down there watching it, and they'd just turn the pumps off if they saw someone doing that. But for the Delta Water Trust, it takes advantage of actually a very interesting system that's developed in Mexico. Mexico has one of the most active water markets anywhere in the world. It's different than, but some ways comparable to what's happening in Australia, with a set of water rights that are actually owned independently of land, and they can be moved around. There's a register and a pretty active market in which, believe it or not, 70% of the water rights are traded annually through lease and sale transactions, which is, Australia, eat your heart out, right? I mean, that's pretty good. Anyway, that system actually creates a pretty robust framework in which the trust can function as a market participant, purchase a right, wheel it through a canal system, and get it delivered where they want it in a place, and no one else can take it back. Yes?
I have a general question for you. You commented that no one realized how significant this was.
a general comment that as you were working on this, you didn't realize how significant it was at the time. Is there a lesson, or do you have advice for us and for the students and practitioners here as they're working on these issues, how to work on these issues when you don't know how they will unfold in the future and how significant they might be?
It's a good question. I mean, I think in some ways the lesson is just do it. I mean, when I started working on the Delta stuff as a law student, I mean, the idea that the U.S. and Mexico didn't even recognize the Delta existed on either side of the border. It was sort of like, whatever, you know, I mean, no one cared about it. The idea that 10 years later, I would be in a negotiation where the country of Mexico would come to the table and tell the United States that the restoration of the Delta is their #1 national priority was unthinkable. But it was just a process of persistence, community engagement, you know, sort of doing the hard work on the ground and just, you know, sort of staying focused on what was in front of you and what you could get done with a plan towards doing something big that seemed impossible, but sort of pursuing that sort of deliberately and not allowing yourself to get sidetracked. And then just recognizing that about most of what you do is going to have unpredictable consequences. Very little of what's happened in this environment has, I mean, it's all gone according to plan, at least officially. That's what we tell the funders. So if there's any of them here, it all went according to plan. But in reality, it was sort of like, you know, you kind of say, well, here's where we want to get, and then we're going to pursue 15 different paths to get there and sort of see what happens. And you know, some of the stuff that we thought, like the pulse flow, it was a science experiment to sort of see, you know, it was cheaper than modeling, frankly. It was like we could spend 10 years building a giant model of this system, or we could just throw some water at it and take photographs of it, and we can see what happens. It's much easier to actually do the flow than to build a computer model to predict what was going to happen. But it ended up being, and it was a science experiment. We've got great data. We've got much better understanding of the system than we had before, and we have a sense of what we maybe need to do now to actually build an ecosystem that can fit within this very complicated management framework and maybe be robust in the face of climate challenges. But more importantly, it ended up becoming a social experiment. I mean, we had no idea that there was going to be this huge community response with this beach party thing I was describing, which was just incomprehensible. The greatest moment of my legal career was sitting on a hill with my good friend Jennifer Pitt, who worked for Environmental Defense Fund, and she and I met each other at our very first Colorado River Conference when we were both students. And we decided we were going to work on this issue together, and we've worked together very closely ever since. And she and I and a couple of folks that weren't really supposed to be there from the federal government, we won't name them, were sitting on this hill looking at this scene of little kids playing in the water and caballeros riding their horses around and people selling grapefruits and stuff. And we're just sort of like, we did this, you know? So, and I think, but we didn't know that was going to happen. We were trying to do a science experiment. We ended up, I think, sort of realizing a community vision that we didn't even really know was there. But as sort of generations of people came, you know, elders were able to bring their kids who had never seen a river to, like, here's what a river looks like. This is what it should look like. And the commitment really that came out of that moment is in some ways more important than almost anything else. No one who was there will ever be able to think about not drying out the Delta completely again. I mean, it'll be very challenging, but you know, there's a commitment on both sides to kind of fulfill that community vision now. Anyway.
I was just wondering, as you went through the scope, through this negotiation process, how, when you had government changes either in Mexico or the United States or within the state governments, how that affected your negotiations and how you were able to have continuity when you, seems like certain states at least, go from left to right.
That was really, really hard. In some ways the hardest part. Actually, the negotiations are timed because the U.S. and Mexico have a staggered presidential election every 2 years. somebody's president is getting elected. And then if the government changes, then everybody gets fired or moves on, and then new people come in and they don't know anything. So there's sort of it takes like 6 or 8 months for them to get up to speed. So it gives you about a 12-month window every other year when you can actually make progress. And the rest of the time you're just educating whoever's new. I think the key to that has been people again. I mean, there have been a few people who have been involved from the very beginning, like Bob Snow in the solicitor's office, like Jennifer Pitt at Environmental Defense Fund, others. A few of the state representatives who, continue to cling to their positions after a decade or more. And those people provide that sort of institutional history to sort of continue the dialogue forward. But one of the big challenges right now in the negotiation is that we've had 5 of 7 state representatives replaced, and 2 of the 3 federal representatives have been replaced. So there's less institutional history than we had before in some ways.
So how do we bring this 319 process of success to overcoming our obstacles here in Montana? Or how would you recommend that other states adopt this successful model?
I think, I don't know. I mean, there are some lessons for this that come out of this for me, and one of them is that I think it is really important to sort of pay attention to the fact that while you need a catalyst and you need sort of a framework, you fundamentally need the engagement of the people that are closest to the problem. I've become sort of professionally suspicious of a lot of the sort of really big, sort of particularly federally led sort of stakeholder exercises. Not that they aren't important, but frequently the people that end up in those processes aren't necessarily representing interests, aren't necessarily the people you want. You want the rancher, you want the Mexican community members who, somehow got 2,000 volunteers to like go out and volunteer to do restoration in Mexico. Those people came out of the woodwork. And you had no idea they were there, but they sort of self-identify. And I think sort of providing room for that sort of stakeholder engagement is pretty fundamental. I think it's really, federal leadership is critical, funding is critical, all those things are critical, but ultimately to me, the most important federal role is as the facilitator of the empowerment of the local people to begin to care for the resource and sort of face the challenges that they have. So, I mean, I think to me that's one of the bigger lessons. I mean, I think another one is that I think the role as a lawyer, the role of litigation can be overplayed. It can be an important hammer, and even in our case, there were these decisions in 2001 that essentially finished off the hope of sort of suing the United States into caring about the Delta, which sort of led to the exit of a lot of groups. But fortunately, the courts left us with a little bit of uncertainty that you could sort of play on, that sort of kept people in the room, because we were all afraid that if we went back to litigation, you didn't know what the outcome was, or maybe more importantly, the outcome would take too long, and so you couldn't necessarily get there within the time that we had allotted. But, all of this was accomplished without a single lawsuit. There hasn't been a lawsuit on the lower Colorado River since 2001 involving an environmental organization. And I think that's an important accomplishment, and it's actually part of the reason we were able to do what we did in this environment. I'm not saying that's true everywhere, but just in this environment, which was so contentious, sort of beginning to create space for people to collaborate was pretty important, and taking some of the threats off the table. No, they're like totally off the table, they're kind of like next to the table, but was pretty critical, and sort of committing to a sort of process of trust. Anyway, I mean, it's a little bit of a different model than the ones I've experienced in other contexts. One more? Do we still have time for questions, or are we? One more? Okay.
Yell. My question related to your comments about the pulse flows being sort of a science experiment and how that might relate to what the thinking is with minute 32x. My understanding is that less than 1% of the pulse flows actually made it to the Gulf, and that part of the reason they think that happened was because the channel was in such a state of deterioration that much of the water put into it just kind of bled out. If that's the case, is part of the idea with 32x to think not only about additional flows, but maybe channel restoration as a way to actually deliver the water to the Gulf and the coastal?
Yeah, there's been some conversation about that. I mean, you're absolutely correct. Only about 1% did get there. And in fact, it was not the water that was released from Morelos Dam. It was actually water that we delivered through a canal wasteway through the irrigation system that actually made it to the Gulf. The channel deterioration is an important component there. Actually, the more fundamental problem is groundwater management. Because of that legacy pumping war I was talking about, where the U.S. and Mexico had these competing well fields, those wells are still there and they're still used, although there's a cap on them now in terms of how much that can be pumped. It's created a trough of depression instead of a cone of depression that extends all the way along the U.S.-Mexico border and extends significantly out into the ecosystem sort of center. And that leaves you with about 20 miles of what's essentially dry channel with depressed groundwater levels, and it's sand, it's a former delta. So moving water over that reach is very difficult to contemplate. In many ways, we knew that was going to happen. The objective, getting water to the Gulf was a cool thing to have happen. There were bets going. I actually won some money on that, on the pool of when the water would reach the Gulf, and if it would reach the Gulf. But I think the recognition is it's going to be difficult to deliver enough water to that estuary through that kind of mechanism to really make a huge difference to the Gulf fishery. There's a separate strategy for that that's actually built around the management of municipal wastewater through the last tributary of the river. Is called the Rio Hardy, where the Delta Water Trust is actually securing some very significant flows that actually will allow for the maintenance of a mini estuary sort of in the upper reaches of the river that'll provide some estuarine function. The primary objective is actually to establish habitat connectivity along the riparian corridor sufficient to maintain endemic migratory birds. It's important to the Pacific Flyway, essentially. And so the objective actually is to get sort of good habitat sites with really good biological connectivity. The hydrological connectivity is really will be fundamentally about fixing groundwater, which is a much longer project on the border. It's actually very doable. The system is actually pretty close to safe yield. It's just that the distribution of pumping is wrong in a way that would really allow the ecosystem to colonize that center dry portion of the delta. So, but yeah, I think the effort now will probably be to think about how to accomplish some of the restoration objectives without necessarily doing it in a single large flood, but maybe multiple staged sort of floods along the river with some things that look like the pulse flow and some things that look more like targeted deliveries to restoration areas or portions of the channel that have good habitat potential. Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you.